And now that we have some basic filtering in place, we're going to go ahead and focus on a different page in our application. We're going to focus on the Create Expense page, which currently doesn't exist. Now, we're not done with the dashboard page just yet. There's plenty more to do, including filtering by dates. But until we can add expenses with meaningful dates, it's going to be pretty hard to actually filter them. So we're going to focus on filling out this page, allowing us to add expenses right from the user interface. Now, the component that we're going to create that contains this form, it's actually going to get reused when we create expenses and when we edit expenses. So to get this done, we're not going to be adding a ton of code directly to the Add Expense page. Instead, we're going to be rendering a single component that has the complexity built in. We're going to render that same component in Edit Expense page as well. So when we go through this process for Add Expense page, we're not just focusing on Add Expense page, we're actually creating something reusable, something that we're going to use on both of these pages. So I'm going to go ahead and close down all of the files except for app.js and Add Expense page. Then I'm going to create the one new component we're going to need. This is the one we'll be reusing on the Add page and the Edit page, and we can call this one expense form.js. So this is going to contain all of the form fields, all of the validation, all of the logic to actually get that form to work. Now, for the moment, we can just create a basic component, export it, and get it rendered over in Add Expense page. So right here, I'm going to import React from React. Then I will create a brand new class. We can call this one expense form. It's going to extend using extends react.component. And we're just going to set up a render method for the moment. We are going to render quite a few things. We'll just start off with some dummy data. So right here, I'll create a root div, and inside of there, I'll just add expense form that text. Now we do need to make sure we're exporting this class, so I will just toss export default right up here, and I am using a class-based component, even though we're not necessarily taking advantage of it just yet, because in a few minutes we are going to start using things like component state. So we have this expense form component in place. I'm going to go ahead and save this and get it rendered over here before we move on. That means I do need to import it. Importing expense form from the file we just created. It's sitting inside of the exact same folder as the current one, expenseform.js. Now that we have it imported, we can actually render it. And this page really isn't going to do a whole lot. All we're going to do is render a title, and we're going to render the component. So right here, we can put an h1 for the title, and we'll set the text value to something like add expense. Then we're going to move on to just rendering the form. So right here, expense, form, perfect. I have expense from up here. I'm going to keep that form. Nice. So we have this in place, and if we save the file, we should see our basic dummy text showing up. So we're getting add expense, that's coming from this component, and we are getting expense form, that is coming from over here. So now that we have the basic version in place, let's focus on actually building out the form and the inputs we're going to need. We have our four fields: description, amount, created at, and note. What we're not going to do is focus on created at all in this video. We're going to handle that in its own video because we're going to be setting up a third-party date picker, and that's a little complex, so we'll tackle that on its own. What we are going to do, though, is focus on the other three fields. So right here, we can start by creating that form tag. Inside of here, we're going to toss some inputs. So first input is going to be for our description. Right here, we're going to have an input type equal to text. We're going to have a simple one-line text input. We can also set up a placeholder, something to show in the input when there is no text typed by the user, description. Next up, autofocus. So autofocus is going to make sure that when we visit the page, it automatically puts the cursor and the focus right on that input. And that's a real great feature. So if I save expense form, and I go over here, you can see I'm already focused on the input, so I can just start typing right away without needing to navigate to the form. Now we're also going to have some other inputs, so let's add those right here, another input. This one is going to be for the amount. I'm going to set the type for this input equal to number, and then I'm going to go ahead and set the placeholder as well. I'll set the placeholder equal to amount, and there is no need to set up autofocus. You can only autofocus on one input at a time. So what we're just going to do is start them off at description, and they can navigate between the rest of the fields on their own. Now, we're not going to worry about doing anything for created at the moment because we won't be really creating an input. We're going to be using a third-party component, so I'm not going to actually add any code for that. We're just going to skip right on to the text area for the expense note. So that's text area, creating these separate opening and closing tags. And once we have those in place, we are going to add just a single attribute that is going to be placeholder. So placeholder, and we can set this equal to something like add a note for your expense. And then we could even just put it in parentheses, optional. So if we save the expense form component, I would expect all of those fields to show up, and we are getting that. Right here we have description, we also have amount, and we get some UI improvements from the browser, allowing them to increase and decrease using these buttons. And down below, we are also getting our note. So this is where we can type the note for the expense. We also need a button, so we're going to go ahead and toss that at the very bottom. This is going to be the form submit button with 2 T's, not 3, and we can go ahead and set the text to this button to add expense. I'm going to save the file and just make sure that shows up as well, and down here you can see it is indeed showing up. Now, the big picture goal here is to use local component state to track the changes to all of these inputs. Only when the user actually submits the form will we do something with that information. So we're going to keep track of the changes to every single input. When they submit the form, we'll actually send it off to Redux to either edit the existing expense or create the new one. Now that does mean we're going to introduce some local component state. So right here, I will set up that state object. And for now, we'll just focus on the first input, description. So I'll set description equal to, by default, an empty string. This is actually the only thing we're going to require the user actually changes. The note will be completely optional. The number is going to start off at 0, which they could use if they want. So the description is really the thing they need to add. Now, how are we going to get this done? Well, step 1 is going to be to set the value for this text input equal to the current state value. So this.state.description. Now, this is going to create a read-only input, which is not what we want. We do want the user to be able to change the value. So we're going to set up on change as well. Right here, we are going to reference something that doesn't exist just yet. It's going to be an arrow function we define up above, this dot on description change. So now we can go ahead and define that, and I'm going to do that right here on description change. Setting it equal to an arrow function. Do we need access to the argument? Yes. We do want to grab that because this is where the value lives. So I can create a const called description, getting its value from e.target.value. Now all we need to do is use this .setState. I'm going to pass in the updater function. I'm going to implicitly return an object, so I have to wrap it in parentheses. And right here, what are we going to set? I'm just going to set description equal to the description variable, so I can use the ES6 object shorthand. Now, if I save the expense form, we should actually be able to change the value of description. I'm going to go ahead and tweak the value. Let's say rent, for example, and if I pull up the the React developer tools, we should be able to actually see the state change. So I'm going to search for, right here, expense form, and right here you can see the state description value is rent. As I change that value, it changes over here. So we have created a binding between the two, which is exactly what we want. Now that we have this done for description, I'd like you to go ahead and get this done for the text area. That means you're going to need to add a new default state. You can call that something like note. Set up note state. Then you're going to go ahead and set up on change and value for the text area. And that's going to work exactly the same way it works for our current text input. So take some time to knock that one out. How are you going to know when you're done? Well, you're going to know because when you type characters in here like ABC, you should see the note state change to ABC, just like we saw the description state change when we edited the description field. Take as much time as you need to get that one done. Set up the new state, create the onChange handler, and configure value and onChange. Test your work, pause the video, and when you're done, click play. All right, let's go ahead and knock this one out. What we're going to do is the exact same thing we just did up here. So first up, default state, note, empty string, done. Now we need to use that value down below for the text area. So the value for this text area is going to come from this dot state dot right here note. Awesome. Now what do we need to do? We have to define onChange. Otherwise we have a read-only input. So onChange equals, we are going to create another arrow function. We might as well just set this up first. This dot, we can call this whatever we like. I'm going to change it to on note change. And now we just need to define this up above to set the state value, and we'll be all done. Up here, on note change equals an arrow function. This arrow function is going to go ahead and name that e argument, because we do need to access it, a const note equals e dot target dot value. Then this dot set state. Right here, what are we trying to do? We are trying to set up our updater function. It is going to implicitly return an object, and we're going to set the note state equal to the value of the note variable. Now, if I go ahead and save the expense form, what are we going to get? We're going to get our empty input, which is expected. Let's pull up the component over here first. I'm going to pull up the expense form component, and we can see we have an empty description and an empty note. As I change the text input, you can see it is indeed showing up over here. If I add new lines, we can see those are accounted for too. So we're going to be able to edit the note text area however we like. It's going to actually save the data as is. Now, you might have tried to solve this a little bit differently. So maybe you tried to get rid of the variable and just referenced e.target.value right here. This would create a one-liner and reduces the need to create a variable. But if you tried this, you probably noticed that it didn't work as expected. So I'm going to go ahead and switch over to the JavaScript console. I'm going to change the description, and you can see that as I change the description, we get a whole bunch of warnings over here. The first one is the most important one. This synthetic event is reused for performance reasons. If you're seeing this, you're accessing the property target, and I'm accessing it after the fact. So the problem here is that we are trying to use e.target.value in this callback, which actually doesn't run right away. So it does work if we pull it out first. It doesn't work if we try to use it in a callback. Now, do they give us a workaround? Sure. If you must keep the original synthetic event around, use event.persist. And we could go ahead and do just that. So right here, I could go ahead and set that up, e.persist. I can save the expense form component. The browser refreshes again. I change the input, and this time everything works. We're not getting any errors. And if I go over to the React Dev Tools, the expense form note state is changing correctly. So those are your two options. You can use e.persist, and you can toss e.target.value in a callback, or you can just pull it off into its own variable first. And that's what I'm going to stick with, but either way is going to work just fine. So there we have it. We now have the description and note state getting tracked. Now that we've completed the challenge, I'm going to go ahead and remove those comments. I'm also going to be switching it back to just using the note variable as opposed to using e.target.value inside of the updater function. Now from here, what I'd like to talk about is amount, and I've saved this for last for a reason. We're actually going to be doing something pretty interesting with this. What we're going to do is enforce a specific format. So for description and note, I don't care what you type in. Pick any key on the keyboard, type it in, and we're going to accept that value. For amount though, we're going to limit you to just the numbers on your keyboard, and we're also going to allow for a decimal place, but we're going to enforce how many numbers you can have after it. So to get all of this done, we're going to need to override what we're doing right now. Instead of just blindly taking in the input and setting it for amount, we're going to use a little bit of conditional logic in our onChange handler. Now, when we have a type of number, we get some benefits. So for example, if I type in A or L or K, you can see it's not showing up. But when I do type in real numbers like 1095, that does appear. The problem is that if we add things like a decimal point, it's not currency. So I can add as many as I like. And we really don't want to allow for this. We want to allow the user to enter at most 2 numbers after the decimal point. Now to actually enforce this, we have to switch away from a type of number to a type of text, and we have to add our own validation code in. So that's exactly what we're going to do. Up above, we'll kick things off by setting up a default state for amount. I'm going to start it off at an empty string, and we're going to use that value for the input value, just like we did previously. Value comes from this dot state dot amount. Now we're also going to be setting up an onChange handler, just like we did before. The functionality in there is just going to be slightly different though. So this dot, we can pick anything we like. I'm going to go ahead and use on amount change, and now we can define it. So right here, on amount change, what are we going to do? We're going to grab the event, we're going to pull the value off of it, and we're not going to blindly set it. We're going to look at that value and add a little bit of conditional logic. So const, we're going to call this one amount and get it from e.target.value. Now in the past, we would have called this dot set state right here, this dot set state, blindly setting the state. Maybe we pass in our updater function, we implicitly return an object, and we set amount equal to whatever was typed in. But we don't want to do this. We want to add an if statement right here. So only under a certain situation do we want to call this dot set state. If we don't meet that criteria, we're not actually going to set the state at all. If we do, great. That means what the user typed in does follow some sort of specific format. Now to define this format, we're going to be using regular expressions. The topic of regular expressions is a big one. There are entire courses on regular expressions, and the goal here is to not create a comprehensive overview. The goal here is to just go through the process of creating one. Now I am going to be using a website to get this done. It's a really great one, regex101.com. It allows you to actually create the regular expression with some test string alongside, and it also walks you through exactly what your regular expression is doing. So let's start with something simple, like a number, 1095. To kick things off, what we're going to do is look for a digit, and we use \d for that. And we actually get a little bit of explanation over here. Matches a digit 0 through 9. Now this is great, but what if we have a number, a letter up front like A? This is something that we don't want to match. So what we're going to do is force the string to start with a digit, and we do that with the caret key. Now you can see we don't have a match. If I remove A, we do have a match. But you'll notice it's only matching the first digit. What we want to do is allow the user to add as many digits as they like. What if we have $1 billion expense? I want to make sure all those zeros actually get registered. So right here, we use the asterisk sign to get that done. Now we are matching 1095, and we would also match much, much bigger numbers. But if we move away from just numbers and we try to add a decimal point, for example, we can see we no longer have a match, which is a problem. I do want to be able to add this number, so we have to handle this part of the string as well. Now this is going to be completely optional, so you could have a decimal, maybe you don't, either way works, but if I do have it, I want to make sure it's actually a match. To create an optional group, we set up parentheses and we toss a question mark at the end. Here we can see what we've done is we've created a new group, matching it between 0 and 1 times. That means you don't have to have this at all, or if you do have it, you just have it once, which is exactly what we want here. I want .50, but not .50.50. So what do we put inside of here? Well, we're going to kick things off by looking for the dot character. We have to escape that with a \/ to match it literally. Then we're looking for numbers once again. So right here, \d. Now, how many numbers are we looking for? Because right now we're just matching a single one. We want to allow for 0 to 2. So we use curly braces to define that range. On the low end, 0. On the high end, 2. Now at the very end, we just toss a $sign. This makes sure that the regular expression ends with what we have here, as opposed to having other characters. And there we go. We have a complete regular expression, and we have an explanation should we want to dive in to the details. All we're going to do is take this regular expression and copy it into our code. We're going to be using the string match method. That would be amount.match to get this done. Match takes our regular expression in. Now the / before and after were provided for us via the website. We're going to add those in and put the regular expression inside, and there we go. If we do find a match, this will run. We will set the state. If it's not a match, we are not going to set the state. And we can play around with this. Over inside of the Expensify app, I can type in some numbers like 1, 2, 3, 4. I can type as many as I want. If I try to type any letters in, you can see they get ignored. I can type a dot character right here, but I can only type it a single time. Right now I'm hitting it again and it's not working. I can type my numbers in, like 12, for example, and you can see that 12 does show up. But if I keep typing in numbers, they completely get ignored. So this is going to allow us to ensure that the number comes in a specific format. Now, we could have gone the other approach. We could have just checked if it was a match later on when we submit the form and shown an error. But by enforcing it right here, we're basically making it impossible for the user to mess up the amount they're typing in. That's where we're going to stop for this video. So in this one, we set up the 3 inputs we need, and we're also tracking their values over time, which is a great first step. We're going to continue working on the add expense page in the next video. So stay tuned, and I'll see you then.